Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the Future of Education. It's Tuesday, October 4th, and our special guest is Dr. Peter W. Cookson, Jr., who's going to allow me to call him Peter tonight. Peter, welcome.
It's good to be here, Steve.
Thank you so much. The Future of Education is sponsored by Web 2.0 Labs. It's my project to help educators use the power of technology to communicate with each other, and Blackboard Collaborate. I now work part-time for Blackboard, but they do provide the platform for the show, and it's greatly appreciated. Coming up, November 2nd and 3rd is our Library 2.0 Worldwide Conference, the Future of Libraries and Librarianship. This is going to be great. San Jose State University is the core and founding partner of this conference. We're just beginning to accept and schedule sessions. We have probably about 150 sessions over the course of 2 days. We have people signed up from 133 countries. Phenomenal. Then on the 14th to the 18th of November, our now annual Global Education Conference on globally connecting educators and students. 5 days, very similar format. Last year I had 15,000 attendee logins. Hoping for a similar response this year. It was like a party. 450 presentations from 62 countries. Just amazing. And I've just announced the Learning 2.0 conference in January, another worldwide virtual conference. Obviously there's a theme here, but look for information on that coming up shortly. Coming up on the Future of Education next week, Timothy Wilson talks about his fascinating book, Redirect, about the power of narratives and reshaping narratives. Gina Bianchini visits with us. Gina, previously the co-founder of Ning, now working on Mighty Bell. David Lorcher on libraries and Web 2.0. Lee Crockett on Literacy is Not Enough. Mark Sermon on the Open Badges Project. That should be really interesting. Lots more coming up there. Brand new on that schedule. You'll see on December 1st is Tasha Bergson Michelson from Google talking about search literacy. That should be really interesting. And of course, the rest that are listed there. Please feel free to join us for any of those. If you have missed one of our sessions, they are all up and recorded. Last week we had a great team talking to us about an iPads in the Classroom project. Really changed my mind about the use of iPads in the classroom. Before that, Cecilia de Oliveira, the Chief Operating Officer, I can't remember what her title is, but head of the Open Courseware Project at MIT, Bob Glinner, the filmmaker, Sam Chaltain on Faces of Learning, Howard Gardner from Harvard. Of course, all of those and many more are up on the website in full Illuminate recordings and in MP3 versions. Okay, so this is the chance where you get to tell us where you're listening from. To the left of the whiteboard, you'll now see some icons. You're looking for the second one down, which is the star, and if you click on that and then you click on the map, you're able to indicate where you're participating from. Feel free to shout out in the chat as well. It's always fun to hear where people are listening from. Looks like India, New Zealand. Pretty diverse for this group tonight. Can't tell if that's someone from Bill, is that you? Look with a yellow dot. Several in North America. Anyway, wherever you're listening from, or if you're listening to the recording, of course, we sure appreciate your taking the time to do so. Peter, this was a great read. There's no other way to put it. This is I'm not sure I agree with everything, but I really, really enjoyed reading this book, Sacred Trust, A Children's Education Bill of Rights. Could you kind of set the stage for us a little and give us a sense of your background, and then if you wouldn't mind telling us what Ideas Without Borders is?
Oh, okay. Well, let me start with that, Ideas Without Borders, and then I'll talk about the book. Ideas Without Borders is an educational consulting firm that I founded here in Washington, D.C., and we focus on basically, and we partner with some other folks and firms around the country. Basically, I'm interested in 21st century education, and particularly as it links to sort of educational rights and human rights, and work with private companies as well as school districts. And I've been doing this sort of informally for a number of years, and then I just sort of decided I'd found Ideas Without Borders. So that's what that is. Well, let me tell you a little bit about the book and how I came to it. You know, I started out 30 years ago or so as a classroom teacher in rural New England, and I loved it. And I taught a fifth grade class, and I can remember each one of those kids as though it was yesterday. And so I got into education, and my career basically, I went back to graduate school, got a doctorate in sociology of education. My main research interest has always been educational inequality and educational reform, mostly in the United States, sometimes overseas, focusing mostly in the United States. And so I've written some things about school choice, and lately I've written a few things about technology, not as a technologist, but just sort of its place, which I'm very positive about in education, very positive about. I don't know a couple of years ago, I kind of pulled a number of things together in my own mind. The first is I'm very, very concerned about the condition of children in the United States. And if you read the book, you'll see the data. But the bottom line, if you haven't read the book, is that we have many kids who live in poverty. We have many kids who do not get enough to eat. I wrote a little piece called The 35,000 Kids a Few Blocks from the White House here in D.C. Every night, there's 35 children. This is by government measures, too. It's probably more if you weren't using government measures. Basically, are hungry. The health condition of many, particularly poor children, is not very good. The schools that they attend, I would say the bottom 40% of schools, particularly in urban and rural areas in the United States, are not really doing the job they ought to be doing. So that was one strand. The other strand is that I'm a big defender of public education. I'm not against charter schools. I'm not against it. I mean, if you look at the book, you'll see I'm for really revamping public education. But the idea that public education is a democratic foundation for the United States is really kind of in my DNA. And having been in educational policy wars for a while, I began to be really worried that we were going to lose that. So that's the other big strand. And the third big strand was that, the United States is increasingly in a very delicate position competitively around the world in terms of its ability to really innovate, not just at the high level, but throughout society. And so I thought we needed, a 21st century educational system. And we have basically 19th century schools, and we have 21st century kids is kind of the way I put it. So those three big strands came together in my mind and sort of popped out of my mind, well, why don't we find a little handle, a little way of saying this that will summarize it. And so I came up with these 10 rights, and I published a little article about it, and then I wondered if there was a book in it, and eventually I did write this book for Corwin Press. And that's kind of how it evolved in my mind. So it's even though I wrote it, a year ago, actually it's been brewing in my mind probably since I was a fifth grade teacher back in the day.
Well, listeners to the show oh, thank you. Yeah, nice tossing it back to me. So listeners to the show are going to know that I've, for a long time, have been sort of proposing this education declaration, which in many ways is very similar, except that my sort of end result was that each individual had built their own education declaration, kind of a set of principles by which they were going to make educational decisions for themselves or for their children. But I loved it for that reason. I'm going to talk, I thought you did a very nice job in the section where you talk about technology, and hopefully we'll get there, but I felt that was very balanced and very thoughtful. The book is structured very clearly to be part of a conversation. Every chapter has study questions, possible action steps, great further reading lists. Are you having people tell you that they're actually using it in that way? Is it getting the adoption that you would hope?
Well, the book came out in May, which is over the summer, and so the book actually is selling pretty well. I think the reason that it was written this way, and Corwin encouraged me to write this way, is I would love it to be a sort of primer for a conversation. I don't even have to be there. A conversation that could happen in school districts and schools and PTA meetings and so forth. That's kind of how I thought about it. I do know that the people that have used it and read it have been using it that way. And when I give a talk about it, basically that's how I structure it. I don't go through all the rights or do all that. I use it as a platform for discussing other people's thoughts about what we can do about public education in particular. So I think it will be used over the next year or so. I think it will be increasingly used, as I hope, as a kind of a prod to a further conversation.
I personally really like the structure and the idea. Tony Wagner was on the show, and we had a long discussion about the work that he had done going out to districts and helping communities build their own kind of education plan. And sort of the end result of that being that they almost always built the same plan, but their participation was the significant piece. And I hear that from you in every chapter of the book. Conversations, town meetings, community meetings. It's really integral to your sort of vision there, isn't it?
Well, it is, because first off, because one of the premises of this book is that public education is really a foundation for democracy. Public schools are still a place where families and communities can meet and have a dialogue about education, but kids in general or whatever. And the schools that I've visited that I've always loved being in were schools where they opened their doors. The doors opened out, so to speak. And they used the schools afterwards, so parent groups, or they could get, high school equivalency degrees, or use the gym, or put on a theatrical. So my book, especially in the beginning, if you look about my idea about sort of my idea of what a school should be, is that it really should be the center of a community. We know a lot from research that community education really does work. And people now are really, especially we're talking about people who are not rich or not middle class, who are really struggling, they need to have a center that provides them with the emotional and practical resources they need to succeed. So I see schools in a big picture and having a big effect, far more than just the academic program. And I also think, Steve, I know we're going to talk about technology in a little while, but I also think technology is a huge partner in this, for people to communicate, for people to reach out to each other, to share ideas, to see each other through video conferencing and a whole variety of other things. So I do see schools as being really a big part of public life.
So the book is about a big idea, right, or the need for a big idea, that we need somebody to recapture our soul. And I think it feels as though you even go a little beyond that, sort of even a more expansive kind of, who are we as the United States of America, and what role do we play in the world? So your big idea for me was that education is the foundation of democracy, and it should be our number one priority. Is that what you wanted me to read?
Yes. That is the big idea, and the other ideas are hopefully important pieces of that. Absolutely, because I had a little interesting experience. So for a period of my life, I got very interested in the founders, and I read a lot about them, and I read a few of their writings and so forth and so on. And I stumbled across this thing by James Madison, in which he talks about, in a State of the Union address, he talks about the national vision for education as being a seminary of learning. And I think that's always been part of the American ethos. Even though public schools are very local in their control, even though we don't want to try to have some national, education ministry telling everyone what to do. It's neither desirable nor is it even remotely practical. But the idea that we share a vision about the future, that we have a common set of goals, if you will, not just goals, but also how we think about each other, this sort of goodness narrative that I believe in. I would love to see public education participating in that more, and see and teachers and principals and parents and children see themselves that way. Because, the United States has a lot of problems, and I'm sure all of us have different views about this, but the fact is that we still can be a hugely wonderful role model to the rest of the world. I don't think that's going to be happening if we allow our public institutions and public education to deteriorate and perhaps even just disappear. If public education were to disappear, it could be different than it is today. I'm not against charter schools, and I'm not against experimentation, but if the concept of public education disappears, I think we will have lost something huge. So yes, it's a long way of answering. You got it.
Good, I'm glad. So you talk about Horace Mann seeing schools as the great equalizer. You talk about a nation of learners. This is one spot in the book where I wished you had gone further, and maybe you consciously chose not to, or maybe you would disagree. But you talk about learning. I'm going to actually get to the page here. It's page 44.
Okay.
If anybody's following along.
Okay.
And you have a quote from James Banks. And you talk about for people to be good participants in a democratic society, they need to acquire the knowledge, values, and skills to participate effectively. Now, we've had a couple of people on the show, Jerry Mintz from Arrow. We've got Scott Nine coming on from the IDEA about democratic schools. How do you feel about the difference between being taught democratic principles and actually living them in a democratic school? Because it felt like you didn't go there, and I wonder if you didn't go there purposely.
Oh, you mean about living the democratic principles?
Right, actually participating in the democratic process as a part of schooling.
Well, you know what? That's a good critique. I believe that. I believe the schools have to be good cradles of democracy. And you very astutely picked up the fact that I didn't really develop that as much as I should have. So, it just should be a longer discussion about that.
Well, I certainly didn't mean it as a criticism.
Benefit by that.
It's a very hard topic.
Yes, it is a hard topic, and particularly now, today, because there's been so much emphasis on standards and quantitative outcome measures and so forth. Look, I think here's the thing. I think it gets misunderstood. I think that people think about democracy in school, some people anyway, think of it as sort of kids doing their own thing and sort of anarchistic, and nobody's really getting down to work, and all the other issues related to non-performance, non-academic performance in school. I don't see it that way. I see it as the kind of glue that keeps people in community. And here's the thing about it educationally, that it's not just a sort of romantic, idea. I say we know. I'm pretty convinced by evidence and through experience that people learn best in environments that are safe, in which they feel their feelings are respected, where they get to work with other people, where they feel that there's a collective sense of purpose. All of those are essentially democratic values, and I think kids learn better in those situations. And I think we can probably, find some good evidence of that, but I don't think you need a lot of research here. I think you can just visit schools. Sometimes when you visit a school, and it doesn't all have to be uniform. I mean, there's no rubric that you can just put on top of all of this. But you visit a school that's really a happy school, and somehow or other, maybe they have their own personality, maybe it's done a different way. Sometimes the principal is more of an important person than other times, and all of that. But there's some sense of community, and that we're working together on something. And to me, that's a core democratic value that, it's getting a little shaky in our society. So, I'm with you on that. I agree.
Good.
Thanks.
And I love what you just said. That sort of has been another one of the themes of the interview series, is sort of the increasing awareness as we've gone through of the importance of building that educational culture locally, and how it can be different, but you rarely see really excellent education without there being a culture there. So let's jump up kind of back to the big idea. So the difficult part of big ideas is getting people to buy into them. Have you followed Finland at all?
I know, I do know a little bit about the research in Finland and what's going on in Finland.
So they obviously, over the course of a few decades, in a very concerted way, at least in the simplistic narrative that we get, made a commitment to changing their education, to supporting teachers, and ultimately to building a culture of trust. That must have been really hard. Have you thought about how we might actually accomplish that in a society like ours that's so pluralistic and sort of so wed to contention?
Yeah, I mean, the Finland example is a good one. First off, what they've done is a model. Of course, I don't know. I think the population of Finland's about 5 million. So that's just 5 times larger than all the public school kids in New York City. So, and it's I don't know if it's a much more homogeneous society, but I think it's considerably. Having said that, I think the way in which they've gone about it, the way in which they think about it, is a model for us. Here's what I think about the United States. We are much more complex. We are much more diverse. We're, of course, a lot larger, and we have different regions of the country. The South is different than the West, and the Northeast is different than the Midwest. I mean, and even within that, there are all kinds of microcultures and subcultures that make even regions different. You just have to sort of drive across the United States to know that. So we're much more diverse. But having said that, there's a unity to experience as well. If kids, now I'm going to just kind of focus on kids. Kids may come from different parts of the country, but they still have the same learning needs. They still have the same emotional needs. They still have the same issues and questions about life. So that if we can find, one of the things I suggest, is that the Department of Education play a somewhat different role in American life, because I think if we can find that commonality, if we can agree on some of these large objectives, whether it's a Bill of Rights or your idea or some other good idea like that, I think there's a lot in common. Now, the question is how do we do this? And honestly, I made a vow not to fight with anybody. I don't know if it comes out in the book. I mean, obviously I have some agreements and disagreements, but one of the reasons I wrote this book was because I've been sort of engaged in these policy wars, particularly the school choice wars, for quite a while, not so much in the last couple of years, but for about 10 years. And I tell you, I got really sick of it. I mean, I got sick of the contention. I got sick of the arguing over nothing, really. I mean, there were minor little points that somehow the policymakers thought were critical, but really weren't that important, or they weren't geared to the core issues of teaching and learning. Because teaching and learning is what schools should really always be about. It can have different flavors and it can feel different, but if you go into a school, I don't care how multicultural, whether it's the South or the East or the North or the West, and they're focusing on learning, you can feel that you're in a good school, and the kids respond. And so we have a lot in common. We just have been pulled apart, I think, in the last 20 years, to be honest with you.
I've been reading a book called On Appreciative Inquiry. And I've never done this, and I don't know more about it than the particular what I'm learning in the book. But it's a process of going out into the community, asking questions, and really building an understanding of what people want to accomplish through questions that are appreciative and allow them to clarify the things that they have liked about what they do in their jobs or their work or their schools. Mm-hmm. Have you seen a process like that, or like Future Search or Open Technologies, where you feel like there's a process that does a good job of helping a community build that education culture?
Well, I haven't actually seen a program. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I haven't seen it, but they may be out there. But I haven't really seen a systematic program like that. Here's what I have seen, is I've seen really good principals being able to turn negative conversations into positive relationships. And that's a leadership problem that I think we have to really honestly address. That there are times, well, if we're thinking about educational reform, we can't underrate the power of the leadership in a school. I mean, maybe a school district too, but in a school. Because that individual, if they have those skills and they have the good heart and they understand how human beings think and they understand what people's needs are and they're not condescending to parents and so forth, I think that becomes a very positive culture in the school. Now, could it be done systematically? I'd love to see it done in a systematic way. I think that would be fascinating.
I know you have made this vow not to fight with anybody, but I'm going to imagine that these leadership schools to produce principals and superintendents who don't come from an educational background probably doesn't mesh well with your vision.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not picking. I'm not picking a fight with them, but I have to say, I think if you don't have classroom experience, I don't want to make that into 100% law, but in general, as a good general, if you don't have that experience, I think it's hard to be an effective leader in education. I have to say that some of my colleagues in higher ed and some of the people you meet who talk about education, it does seem that there's a difference between those that have actually been teachers or something very similar to that, and those that haven't. And it's not that it's not a bright line or something, but first off, they realize that it's really hard work. That's the first thing. This isn't easy. That's the first thing. Secondly, they realize that you're dealing with kids. So kids don't read these books. They don't go through all these things, and they have, especially little kids, well, I'll do, but that's thinking about little kids right now. They come to school with many, many needs. I mean, physical needs and emotional needs, and those need to be attended to. So leadership academies that take a corporate model, essentially, sort of a top-down corporate model, probably look really good on paper, but I don't actually. They don't think they work well in a human service organization like a school. In general, there may be exceptions, but as a principal, no. I'm not arguing with anybody, but you got me on that one. I would be skeptical.
So there was one other place in the book where I had wished you'd gone further. And again, not a criticism, but just a personal curiosity, and that was for me in the role of teachers in helping reshape education. And part of what I'm seeing is that the technologies of the web are allowing, like in the Arab world, to redefine who has a role in building narratives around institutions. And I'm feeling like there's this great, rich resource of teachers now who are using Twitter and Google Plus and blogging and social networks to really clarify their own visions of education, who are this potent force for good, and yet they don't get called on very often.
Yeah. Well, first off, I totally agree with you. I think someone needs to write that book. I mean, I think if you look in the sort of dedication of the book, I talk about teachers really because I have enormous respect for teachers. And your point being that there's a lot of local, when I say local, classroom reform, school-wide reform, a couple of classrooms working together where teachers are doing great things. They don't tend to write books. They don't tend to, do all of that. So it's kind of local and people may not know about it. But it's hugely important because the classroom, even though with technology we can have a world classroom and it can look differently and we can do a lot of things, the kids are still going to get together in some kind of space in most cases. So a classroom's eminently important, and I agree. We're not tapping into the huge talent base of the teachers. There are 3 million teachers in this country, and we're not tapping into what is a huge talent base, and they are left out of the conversation quite often, and I think that's a real shame. It's as though somebody who never taught before knows more about classrooms than a teacher. But I also know, and I think when I was writing this book, honestly, I don't think I was aware of it as I might, so if you write a book and then it takes, another 6 months to get it published and yada, yada, yada. I think if I were writing today, I would talk more about the use of Twitter, the use of Facebook, the use of the sort of, what the creative projects are that are going on in the classroom now. I think it holds great promise, actually. And a lot of curriculum can be class teacher developed. Go ahead, Steve.
No, I completely agree. And I'm not sure it's just curriculum as much as I'm also seeing a really thoughtful and articulate voice for how to rethink teaching and learning. That's the piece that I also feel as though isn't getting tapped into. So let's sort of segue from that to some of the high-profile investment in educational technology firms and some of the sort of what are called the Billionaire Boys Club kind of initiatives around education.
Uh-huh.
How do those match with your vision? And yeah, just go with that.
Okay. Well, here's the thing. First off, anybody who wants to do the right thing, we should applaud that. But in the book, I make a point of saying that I don't think that many of these large companies, the online companies and the Microsofts and all of that, I'm not sure they really understand the culture of schools. And so some of their investments are really not going to, yield the results that they might hope for. And, some evidence of that. My idea is if all these people who are really geniuses who've created these huge companies have changed the world in a really tiny bit of historical time, and we don't even know where this is going to go, got together and really, instead of trying to shore up this 19th century system, instead of trying to sort of do little piecemeal reforms that, frankly, often they don't really understand, if they could concentrate on the creating 21st century curriculum and training teachers in that regard and preparing teachers and offering services and curriculum and just concentrate on that and use their resources and their genius to do that, I think they would make a huge contribution. They could either sell it very cheaply or give it away, or, in the book I talk about the Department of Education being a facilitator of this. But I mean, that's where I think their genius lies and their value lies. I think when they start thinking that, well, we'll have all charter schools, I think it's a politicized environment that I think eventually they won't feel comfortable in. And B, frankly, it might look good on paper, but it may not actually work in reality. And so I would stick to what their main strength is, which is to really think about how human beings communicate, how they can communicate, and to create, as you said in the Middle East, a whole new way of creating a dialogue in schools and between schools not only nationally but also internationally. That would be a huge service in my estimation.
Does
that seem...
Yeah, no, great. Is there a fundamental disconnect between the measurements and talents that drive business success and the sort of philosophical underpinnings of democracy, family, and education? Are they enough in different categories that it's dangerous to try and see business solutions to education problems?
Well, that's a really good question. Because actually I sort of deal with this on a day-to-day basis. Here's what I think. I don't think there's really a contradiction, but I do think that if you're going to invest in the public sector and you're going to use public dollars and you're going to be dealing with something as important to everybody as public education, you can't just see it as a strict business deal. Because if you go in with that concept, you're probably not going to succeed because schools will resist you. And when teachers resist, they don't get into an argument with you. They just don't do it. That's how they resist. They resist the principal that way. They resist companies that way. They just don't do it. So the business doesn't succeed. I think that the businesses that really care about public education get to know their customers, to use a business term, which is primarily the teachers in the sense of the ones that use it, understand what a teacher's life is, understand what he or she needs to be able to do in the course of the day, be sympathetic to the complications of a classroom. Classrooms are complex. You're dealing with 30 kids in a classroom. That's a very socially and emotionally complex environment. Then I think they can be great partners. But not only great partners, I think they can really help teachers. And in the meantime, they can make some money. But if it's sort of like, we know better, we have the answer, just try this edu-gadget or turn on this program, that's not going to work. And I think it demeans teachers, and it's a formula for failing as a business ultimately.
So there's a theme in the book.
Anyway.
Oh, good. There's a theme in the book that the core problem is how we treat children, and that it doesn't reflect well on us.
Right.
So talk to us about the poverty issue.
Okay. Well, it is. I said that was like something that's really was a huge motivator to write this book. Well, first off, let's get a clear picture of what we're talking about here. If you included not only the kids who are defined as poor, that 20 to 25%, but you also included kids who come from poor and the working poor and working class, lower middle class, and sometimes middle class families, you're talking about a very large number of youngsters. You're probably talking about 40% who do not necessarily, or more, who have the resources that we would think to really be able to function well in school. So A, that's number one, that's big. B, unfortunately, at least from my perspective in the last 30 years, we have basically taken the safety nets away from families. I was once a social worker and back in the day in the 60s. I don't know if it's a great system, but there was a support of families. We've taken away a lot of support systems so that a lot of these families do not have any safety nets. And what does that actually mean in reality? It means that the parents probably both have to work at low-paying jobs and get up early and travel long distances. It means that very often these kids live in dangerous neighborhoods. It means that very often these kids do not get their health, attended to. Kids go to school. Their hearing may not be right. The asthma is practically an epidemic. People get asthma when they live in inferior housing conditions. So that's part of it. And I guess what really motivates me is it just feels just wrong. That's why I started the book with the Nelson Mandela quote, how we treat our children is a measure of our soul as a nation. It doesn't feel right. And I don't know if I have this in the book, but I'll tell you the thing that really was the spark, I guess, that lit the flame to write this book was I was visiting a school. And it was a good school, and someone had recommended it to me, and it was in a working class neighborhood. It was multicultural, and I liked it. The principal was great. The teachers were really working hard. It was a good school. And it was lunchtime, and the principal said, well, why don't you grab a bite to eat with the kids, and we'll continue on the day. So I went to the lunchroom and got in line with the kids, and it was this kind of little plastic food thing, and the food was very basic, some peanut, tubs and apples and crackers. It wasn't a lot. And what I noticed was the kids were putting their stuff in their pockets. And I began to observe the kids, and one little girl in particular, and she was basically taking this food and hiding it and being very protective of her food. And I thought, my God, this little girl is really hungry. And I thought, this just, in a country like ours, with the money that we have, the money that we spend on all these other things, it just seems like a national scandal of the first order to me. And the thing is that education is the key, both the short-term and the long-term key for these kids. Very often the school is the only place where they're going to find some stability, some hopefulness, learn the skills they need to succeed, learn the socialization skills they need. And so I just think as people we have an obligation to provide these kids with the best schools we can possibly put together. So a lot of this book is written from that perspective.
So we're going to move to Q&A in a short bit. So I want to give you a chance to kind of talk about your solutions and the ideas that you have. And I'm especially interested in kind of how you would balance this vision you have for the Department of Education with the value you also see in those local conversations and discussions.
Okay. Well, here's how I see that. I think to have a national vision is a framework. It's not interfering with schools. It's not telling everybody what to do, but it's a framework. It's a framework, in my case, I think the Bill of Rights gives us a framework, but it could be other things too. I'm not obsessed by that, but we need a framework that has a national vision that says this is what America ought to be and this is how we ought to treat each other. So that's one. But and the other thing about the national vision is that the money that we do spend ought to be spent thoughtfully, not pitting one state against each other or being lost in a lot of essentially subtopics. Recently, President Obama suggested a school building campaign. That makes sense to me. That's something the federal government can do, is to help build schools. That makes sense. And there are other things as well like that. But at the same time, I have a kind of a layered approach to this. The bottom line, even though there might be a state control and maybe I have these educational regional ideas so kids can share across states, but the bottom line is that each community has essentially a community center school, that they have a school that they can use as a way of building a stronger community and stronger families. So that's the idea. Implementing this would be very difficult, especially in today's political environment. But I have faith, I don't know if it would be exactly the way I wrote it, but I have faith that there isn't going to be another wave of reform that's going to be similar to the way you and I have talked tonight, that will be much more grounded in the kinds of things you and I have touched on. So I haven't despaired about that. I think we might be on the verge of something really good. I just have that faith because I think people love their schools, and ultimately that affection will make a huge difference in the way we think about education. There's going to be a lot of kids going to public school in the next decade, and I hope that we do something similar to what I'm suggesting.
Well, I had kind of mixed emotions. I probably, I would imagine I'm reflective, because at one point in the book you say, we expect expertise and experience in defense, foreign affairs, and monetary policy because we consider these areas of public life to be essential for national security and economic health. But is education today any less important? And I immediately knew the point you wanted to make, but for me, defense, foreign affairs, and monetary policy are arguably areas in which I have great difficulty with what we do right now. And it led me to this connotation of, do we really want those same decision makers making decisions about education?
Well, I think you and I agree about that, and that's a good point. I think the assumption is, that sort of like Alexander Hamilton's, again, the last chapter about the Department of Education, when a government loses a sense of people, it's no longer really functioning. And at least from my point of view, at least in large part, our government has lost a sense of the people, has lost the sense of what people really need and what the daily life of people is happening. So I guess my unspoken assumption is that we would use this expertise for the good. And I hope that's true. But your point is very well taken, because if you have the wrong people making these decisions, consequences can be dire in any of those areas, whether it's finance, defense, or diplomacy or education. I agree. I'm assuming that there's a pool of talent and goodwill out there that we could tap. But I hope that's not being completely naive.
Well, I wondered if you had seen at a state level or even a smaller educational organizational level, some examples of this where you felt like, okay, this has been done successfully in this state or in this region, and so we can model that and expand it.
That's a good question. I don't know if I've ever seen it at the state level. What I have seen are local schools. I've visited schools around the country, and there are schools that are really prototypes of what I'm talking about, in terms of they don't need to have a children's bill of rights. They honor those rights just in the way they go about their life and their work. So I have seen it at the school level. Occasionally, although not recently, I've seen it sometimes at the district level with a charismatic superintendent. It's a little hit or miss, and sadly to say, some of those people have a hard time holding on to their job. But the right kind of superintendent can sometimes do that at a district level. At the state level, I think it gets a little difficult, because I'm not an expert in state educational policy, but my observation through business and traveling around is that they tend to be very rule-driven and not really think about the fundamental core mission of schools. So I think right now, if we were going to look for any examples, it'd be fun to do that, actually, is to give some examples. I think it'd be at the school and sometimes at the district level.
We're at a place in the show where we normally kind of shift gears a little and make sure that questions that the audience has get answered.
Sure.
So if you have a question for Peter, you can raise your hand. That's the third icon over that lets you, it's the raise hand icon. If you hover over it, you'll see the raised hand icon. And then we'll give you the microphone so you can come in. Or you can put a question in the chat. And while we're waiting for that, I have a couple of ones that I'm interested in following up on. There was a point recently when President Obama was talking about the need for education to fulfill jobs, and there was a lot of pushback from economists that our job situation isn't really easily identified as a lack of education, but maybe some other factors. So my question to you would be, what's the core value of education, and do we need to come to consensus on that? Is it for jobs?
Yeah.
Is it...
Well, yeah, that's a good question. A long time ago, I wrote an article called "The Intrinsic Value of Education," and I would have thought Socrates had thought of that first, but people thought it was a novel idea. Honestly, I think the most important thing about education is its intrinsic value to the individual, and they may define that in different ways. That's the first, and that's not the only thing that's valuable, but that's the core thing. Because when education should allow a person to develop their talents, to develop their abilities to think, their abilities to share with others, so it's that intrinsic satisfaction that comes from that kind of growth. That, I think, is the core value. Now, does that translate into the social skills and the practical skills you need to survive in society and thrive? Absolutely yes. But here is the kicker. This is a kicker for people who want to draw simple analogies. First off, the occupational structure it's pretty well set. It changes. I mean, we have all sorts of new changes, but there's an occupational structure. And just by educating people doesn't mean that there's going to be more jobs for them to fill. That's just not true. I mean, what you have is you could have a lot of college-educated cab drivers, so to speak. So there's a lot of truth in that it's a little bit of a oversimplification, maybe even a romanticization of relationship of education to the economy in that way. But if we don't have a base of people who are able to function in the age of electronics, in the new world that we live in general, there'll be a decline in the ability of people to work successfully and earn a good paycheck. So this, it's a complicated question, but fundamentally, if you ask me what I think is important, it's the intrinsic value.
So if we drill down on that intrinsic value, I would say for me, and I'm kind of inventing this as I say it, so I'm hoping you'll be able to do a better job than me. But there's kind of a personal freedom that takes place as you, and probably at different levels as you are educated. But just literacy, of course, at the first level, and then an independence of thought or an ability to work with others. So how would you kind of parse out that? Would personal freedom be the phrase you would use, or what would you say?
Learning is a liberating, freeing experience. I think the process of learning is freeing. I didn't have, when I went to school, I did not necessarily have a great time. I was basically functionally illiterate until I was in my mid-20s. I could get a driver's license and I could sort of pass tests, but in terms of reading for meaning, because I had such a chaotic school experience, it was very difficult for me. And I had a great teacher who, I don't even know if he meant to do it, but he opened my eyes, and somehow the whole life to the mind, suddenly came to me as a kind of a change of heart kind of thing. So I think the greatest thing about education is self-knowledge, is creating a framework around the world, around society that makes sense so you can understand the world around you, to not believe in superstition, to believe in logic, but also of the heart, but, to understand that there's a cause and effect relationship, to be a critical thinker, to be able to share with others and listen. I mean, all those skills I think are personally incredibly liberating. And when we deny kids the opportunities to have, and by the way, you can't measure that, and you can't say, well, we'll do it for a year and then we'll do something else. People don't grow that way. I have it in the book. Some people are just they are sort of linear and they grow that way, but other people, like me, they were not really engaged in these activities, and then something happened in their life and they suddenly became engaged. So we need to keep those open. We don't want to close that off. But I agree. Personal freedom and education are inseparable. How can you be a good citizen if you can't think independently? And the other thing I want, and maybe you have some questions, but the other thing I want to say about that is that we've sort of grown accustomed to the idea that education is all about consensus thinking. We want people who think differently. We're not going to do well unless we have dissident thinkers, unless we have people who challenge the status quo, ask difficult questions, refuse to be sort of bamboozled. Those are the, Martin Luther King once said that society will be saved by those who are creatively maladjusted. I just think that's fantastic because I agree with that. And so schools have to leave room for kids that think differently. Maybe they'll be resist authority and may give us a hard time, but they may be the good thinkers in the next decade.
I'm fascinated by our I'm fascinated by our historical perspective on the 60s. It feels as though we have a love-hate relationship with that period of time. It was both a time of questioning, asking important questions, but also came with a lot of things that people felt were sort of socially negative costs. And that in many ways, the period of time since then almost feels as though it's been a reaction to that conformity is sort of the sort of underlying value that guides a lot of what takes place. There's not really a question there, but I'm curious as to your response to that.
Yeah, I think you summarized it pretty well. The 60s were kind of formative years for me. I graduated from high school in 1961 and went in the Army, then I went to college, I got a degree, I started got married, had kids, so that was a formative period for me. And I was excited by many things around the 60s, and here's what I was excited by. I was excited by the freedom of thought. I was excited by that people were willing to question the status quo. I was excited by the life of the mind. People read a lot. They argued about ideas. It was the birth of the women's liberation movement, and that was exciting. It was a time of the civil rights movement. So it seemed like a time of hope. From my perspective, unfortunately, what happened is that the culture grew alongside of it, that it wasn't all that positive. It was more narcissistic. It was all about, do your own thing. It was associated with the use of drugs. It was associated with dropping out and kind of withdrawing from society. And some people of that generation, of my generation, really did act in bizarre and unhealthy ways. And unfortunately, that became the model of how people think of the 60s. And that's very unfortunate. First off, they were not a majority. Actually, most people were very conservative, as they are in any era, but those who participated in the 60s, that's what it was. It wasn't all about that. It was about kind of what we were talking about, the intrinsic value of life and developing your own genius, if you will. And I'm sorry that it got derailed, frankly, because I think by getting it derailed, we've lost a lot of that positive energy, and it's as though, Steve, this is going to sound a little different than we talked about. There's a basic assumption in educational reform that the schools are sick and society is healthy. I don't actually believe that. These are all shades of gray, but I don't really believe that. Schools need to leave them aside for a minute. Society isn't necessarily, we don't want to necessarily reproduce the society that we have today, tomorrow, and the next day, and a decade from now. There are lots of things in our society that need to be changed. So the idea that schools should just reproduce this, I think, is a bad model. And in the 60s, people were trying to change society. And as I said, some may have done it in ways that were not very productive. But the idea was good, I think, and I guess it's still in my heart.
I keep watching
I always think of that.
I keep watching the Occupy Wall Street movement and wondering if it will turn into a thoughtful, the Tea Party feels as though it's contentious, whether in fact or in representation. But Occupy Wall Street is fascinating to me because it doesn't seem to have that same emotional context, and yet people are saying, we're not really happy with what's going on here, and we're willing to say that we're not happy.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think this takes us a little away, but not really away from education, because I think what's happened in the last 30 or 25 years politically is that our elites, if you will, the people who are basically the leadership class, have, I call it an enclosure movement, have basically are living in a different space than almost, the vast majority of Americans, not to mention people around the world. And I think there is a lack of communication. I think that's how I see the Tea Party. These are people who feel like they've been forgotten and left out, and they're angry about it. And I think the Occupy the Wall Street group, are, again, slightly different kinds of folks, but I think it's the same thing, because sometimes we're asked to believe something that we know just basically isn't true. And so I think we're going to see more of this, because I don't think the economy is going to snap back in some magical way, and I think we're going to see more and more people questioning a lot of these things. And as long as it doesn't go haywire, as sometimes it did in the 60s, that could be a very positive thing for the country.
Okay, we've got about 4 minutes left. I quickly wanted to, you mentioned that one teacher who made the connection for you. I've been frantically trying to find the page in the book, and of course I'm not. But it felt to me like that was kind of the gist of your section on technology. Technology's great, but it's those individual connections that are most important. And if the technology facilitates that, great. If it doesn't, then we have to be a little bit careful.
Yeah, that's the way I feel. I think if it's an extension of that intrinsic value of education and a kind of a positive learning environment, I think it's fantastic. If it becomes a substitute for that and becomes cold, then I think it'll not be helpful to kids in the long run. And I've seen teachers. I've seen it both ways. I have an example there. I know we don't have much time, but I've seen teachers use it fantastically, and then I've been in schools where it didn't feel all that great for kids in the long run. Maybe especially over time. But I think technology is going to be one of our greatest hidden assets in this whole struggle for public education. So that's probably a different topic, but I'm very positive about the uses of technology for improving education.
I think you quote Seymour Papert. Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, I do. Yes. Yeah. Papert talks about the computer as basically, this machine that's just changing. Of course, it seems like a long time ago. He was writing 10 or 15 years ago. But, fundamentally, he was saying this is not just another machine. This is a whole different way of organizing reality. And I think he's right. I think it is. I don't even begin to understand all the complexity of it, but I can observe it, and I know that it's true. Look, think of a classroom where we could have adaptive assessment, where kids, instead of just taking a test, could go online and play a game, and we have that. There are programs like that, and where the computer actually using artificial intelligence can create a lesson plan for the kid next day that meets their learning needs that day. Those are fantastic breakthroughs, not to mention all the communication breakthroughs, but there's all kinds of things, diagnostic things that technology will be able to do to help teachers. I think we're just at the beginning of this movement. As long as we keep that beating heart of the school, really the kids and the teachers, we'll be okay.
Peter, I really want to thank you for coming on the show. I'm clapping for you. I'm going to the icon.
Oh, well, I'm delighted. It's been a great conversation.
I have to tell you, I've loved all my interviews, but this is right up at the top. There's something about your voice and what you've said that has really made a difference for me, and Bill is in the chat is saying thank you. We do have a commitment to our presenters that we finish on time as a courtesy, and so
sure.
Coming up, next week, Timothy Wilson on Redirect and Gina Banchini on Mighty Bell. Thanks again to Peter for being here. His book, Sacred Trust, A Children's Education Bill of Rights. Peter, in all sincerity,
Thanks,
thank you
Steve.
so much.
Thank you, Steve. I love this conversation. I'm delighted and privileged. It's been wonderful. Thank you. You've been great.
Yeah, it's a mutual admiration society. I would love to have you back on sometime, so we'll look forward to that at some point. Thanks again. Have a great night, everybody. Take care. Good night.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.